Vivian. They want to send it back to the time. I know. Kind of around everything, but we're going to get started. One step. Yeah, one step.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I'm very sorry we're starting a little bit late, but I hear the traffic's been bad. So I'd like to thank Danny Beaton for the lovely music that he has just and I would ask the speakers to please come up to the table. Honduras Rights Monitor Committee. We thank you all for coming out tonight to listen to our speakers this evening. We have 4 wonderful speakers, starting with Karen Spring. She is going to be speaking in regards to the grassroots issues that are occurring on the ground in Honduras related to the political prisoners and the human rights crisis. We have Marissa Varela, and she will be speaking as a member of the Honduras community in Toronto. And we have Eve Engler, who has come all the way from Montreal. Thank you very much for taking that journey, Eve, to discuss Canada's role in Latin America and specifically in Honduras. And then shortly we will be joined by Tyler Shipley, who will be here after he finishes teaching his class. So I would just like to give you a little bit of a background on our work, which started in January of 2018, when Edwin Espinal, a spouse of Karen Spring, was arrested for his human rights work in Honduras. We were very, very horrified and upset in our Spring family, and we reached out to our community of Elmvale for some assistance. And the first place I went to, of course, was my neighbor down the road, Christine Nugent, and she said, well, we have to start a committee and we have to get together and start to work and advocate for Edwin's release because he is a political prisoner. So we gathered a committee together, and we were totally amazed at the number of people in our rural community who came out to support our work and to advocate for Edwin's release. Now, at the beginning, I thought it would be very easy. I would call our MP, and my husband John would call our MP, and they would go right to the Honduran government and demand that Edwin Espinal be released, spouse of a Canadian citizen. Of course, I found that was not the case, and it took many, many months of work. And the further we went into the situation and advocated for Edwin's release, took many, many trips to Ottawa, spoke to many people, liaised with many different groups across Canada and the United States, we realized that it was an extremely difficult situation. And so we started this long, long process. And that is the history behind the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor. And we still have work to do because Edwin and the other political prisoners, whether they are out on bail or they are out in public, they are still political prisoners. They still are not free totally. So that was our issue, and we were very upset at the fact that our government of Canada did not give us the support that we wanted and that we needed. We had a few local MPs that were excellent in helping us out and to advocate for Edwin's release, but in the big picture, the assistance, the support, the solidarity was not there. Hence, our meeting this evening, we would like to talk about Canada's role in Latin America, particularly in Honduras, and what now? What can we be doing now to move forward? So, our first speaker of the evening will be Karen Spring. I would like to welcome Karen.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome. This microphone is kind of giving us a little bit of issues, so I apologize for any of the loud noises. Thank you very much for coming tonight to this event and taking the time. Thank you to the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor, Christine, who's in the audience, and the amazing women that have been through this whole process with me, Kate as well, and Meg. Thank you very much to this church, St. Stephen's in the Fields, for the space. As my mom mentioned, my name is Karen Spring, and I'm the Honduras-based coordinator for the Honduras Solidarity Network. And I've lived and worked in Honduras for 10 years, basically since the...
I'm sorry, you better give it to me. I'll turn it back. You'll have to go. No, don't do it. I'm going to turn it up. My apologies, everyone.
It's the speakers, we can't get it to stop. Anything you can do?
Okay. It's not terrorizing us anymore.
Okay, so I'll just, we'll have to speak really loud. Can people hear us?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Okay. Like I was saying, I've been living and working in Honduras for over 10 years now. And I coordinate the work of the Honduras Solidarity Network, which is a network of over 30 organizations from Canada and the United States, mostly from the United States. So it's over the last year and a half, basically since Edwin was arrested in January of 2018, it's been really difficult for me to be able to come home to Canada. I, especially when Edwin was in prison, because I had very limited opportunities to see him. He was held in a maximum security prison where there was no phones and there was no letters or any sort of communication permitted. And so my only way of being able to see him was to physically go into the prison once a week on the weekends to actually be able to talk to him for about 3 hours. So leaving meant not being able to see him or know how he was doing, both like emotionally but also physically, and just being able to support him, being present inside the prison with him. Edwin was in prison for almost 19 months. He was released on August 9th, so a little over a month ago, and a lot of people have been asking me how he's doing. He is out, so he's been released on bail. He has conditions imposed on him by the courts. He has to sign before a judge every week to show that he will show up for his trial. And he's not able to leave the country, which is why he's not physically here speaking to you all this evening, although I think he's probably watching on the Facebook Live as we speak. Like I mentioned, Edwin was in a maximum security prison in really awful conditions. He had 1 hour sunlight every 2 weeks, or a total of 2 hours per month. They didn't feed allowed to take food in except once a week when we went to visit him, and even then we were under really strict restrictions of what we could bring in and what we couldn't bring in. And they would arbitrarily change every week depending on how the guards were feeling or how the director was feeling that particular week. It's also been really hard for me to get home because after Edwin was arrested, I'm a human rights defender, and one of the things that the Honduran government did was they started to target me to keep me from going into Honduras and leaving Honduras. And so they threatened to basically expel me, and then when I left, to not let me back in the country, which is just one of the in relation to what Honduran human rights defenders face, it's really not a big issue. But for me, it was really devastating personally because in order to see Edwin, I had to physically be in the country. So that was very difficult. For me. So after fighting for a year and a half, like I mentioned, and with a lot of international solidarity through the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor, a lot of people from the community of Elmvale, from Simcoe County, from people from the U.S. and in Europe, Edwin was released a little over a month ago. But we found out 2 weeks ago that the prosecutor and the Honduran government want to send him back to prison. They appealed the decision for him to be released, and so he could, at any time within the next couple of weeks or months, depending on how fast or slow the Honduran government decides to move the case in the courts, he could go back to prison along with Raul. Raul is another political prisoner that was also in the maximum security prison, and Edwin and Raul together are two of over 30 political prisoners at different times that were held in prison, and there's still 9 political prisoners that are in prison today. Just 2 weeks ago, the Honduran government sent 7 more people to the maximum security prison as well, people that were protesting, people that were defending their water supply in their communities, and because they were protesting and because they were speaking out against the government, they were, like Edwin, sent to prison as well. So Edwin, as I mentioned, was a political prisoner. He was targeted specifically because he's been very vocal against the government for a very long time, basically since the 2009 military coup in Honduras that I'll speak a little bit later about, and that Tyler Shipley will speak about as well. He was sent to prison because he's one of thousands of Hondurans that went to the street in 2017 in the context of elections. So elections are coming up next month in Canada, and they have elections every 4 years in Honduras. And so there was mass electoral fraud in Honduras. People were angry that their votes were not respected, and so thousands of Hondurans took to the streets. And in that context, the Honduran government arrested Edwin and a whole bunch of other people for basically protesting and trying to defend their votes as a result of the fraud. And so the way that the Honduran government targeted Edwin, the way that they're sending people to prison, is what happens to Hondurans when they speak out and when they're vocal and they're critical of the government. And currently, the government in power, the president's name is Juan Orlando Hernandez, and he was basically elected under these fraudulent elections in 2017.
How is that spelled?
Juan Orlando Hernandez. I can give it to you later if you want. Yeah. So what the Honduran government, what they're doing with Edwin, Edwin's an example of one of thousands of Hondurans that face serious consequences if they speak out against the government. The Honduran government persecutes, they murder people, they threaten anyone that speaks out, and they don't just threaten the individual, but they also threaten their families as well. And so this has been going on for several years. There are 2 women in the crowd that have red t-shirts on with a face of a woman named Berta Cáceres. She's another example of somebody that spoke out consistently against the Honduran government. She's very, very well known. She's world-renowned. She spoke out against the government trying to stop a hydroelectric dam in her community on indigenous land, and she was murdered in her home as a result by people linked to the Honduran military. And so Berta Cáceres is an example. Edwin is an example of what happens to people in Honduras that stay in Honduras, that don't flee to the border of the U.S. border and request asylum in Honduras, but want to try and change the daily reality of what's going on in the country. And this is what happens. What happens to Edwin? What happens to Berta? It happens to lawyers. It happens to journalists. It happens to women. It happens to land defenders or people, small farmers that just want to work their piece of land to make ends meet. But that a large company that's linked to the government or linked to foreign interests want to take over for mining interests, for African palm interests, or to build a hydroelectric dam that basically leads to profits, some serious profits for these companies. So in Honduras, since the 2009 coup and since the 2017 electoral crisis, things have continued to get worse and worse and worse in Honduras. And I know this firsthand because I've been in the country for 10 years, and I've seen the conditions in the country get worse and worse for the general population, but particularly for people that are vocal against the government. Just yesterday, there was a group of people that blocked a road that led to a national reserve or a national park in the capital city, Tegucigalpa, where I live, and they were shot at like they are every single day in Honduras for being in the streets and protesting the government. And 4 protesters were injured by a bullet yesterday, and this is something that's happening on a daily basis in Honduras. And like I said, it keeps getting worse and worse every year. 2 years ago, before the electoral crisis in 2017, the Honduran government didn't open fire on protesters, but now they're doing it regularly. Any protesters that go to the streets now are being shot at and killed. And so there's no freedom of expression. There's no chances for people that want to stand up and defend their human rights, defend their freedom of expression, or just say critical things against the government or against the government's interests. So after Edwin was arrested, myself as a Canadian and then the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor, as my mom mentioned, started contacting the Canadian government. We spoke to people in Minister Freeland's riding, we wrote them emails, we met with the Canadian consulate in Tegucigalpa, we planned several trips to Ottawa to speak to different MPs from all parties. The Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor, the women in the crowd, the people from Simcoe County here, along with my mom, wrote countless letters, went to schools to give talks. Kids in schools started writing letters to their representatives. My family members went to their representatives. We had billboards put up in Simcoe County, thanks to a local business that supported our cause. We had MPs themselves writing the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, whose actual district I think we're in right now, who's running again in the elections in October. And like I mentioned, various trips to Ottawa. And we received really no response, nothing. And we, at one point, demanded to have a meeting with Freeland. We know that Freeland and the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, have met with family members of political prisoners in other countries, like in Venezuela, people that are not Canadian citizens, but they've met with them to talk about human rights issues in other countries. So we figured that, since they've met with those people, that they would also meet with us. Nothing. No meeting with Minister Freeland's office. No response from Minister Freeland from any of the emails that I wrote her personally to her email. As a Canadian that's worked on human rights issues in Honduras for 10 years, this didn't surprise me because I've been working for many years, speaking to members of Parliament, going to parliamentary committees, talking about human rights issues and the support of the Canadian government towards the Honduran government, and I've been ignored for 10 years. But it came as a surprise to a lot of people in Simcoe County and a lot of people in my family that we couldn't even get an email from the Foreign Affairs Minister acknowledging the issue, speaking out about the issue. And we know that Canada has talked about the importance of standing by human rights defenders and supporting human rights issues abroad. And so, I'm going to leave it to Tyler and Yves to talk more about that and to maybe give some reasoning as to why that is. But I've worked in Honduras for 10 years, and so I know that Canada has always really stood beside or supported and been very, very supportive of their own economic interests in the country. And so I, for 10 years, have worked alongside communities that are these communities that are targeted, are these human rights activists that are targeted, that are speaking out against things like mining, and speaking out against things like tourist projects being illegally built on their land. And so I've known for a long time, and I think the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor has also known that, or come to learn that Canada is very much concerned about its economic interests in the country and much less about human rights issues, and standing up for human rights defenders like myself, like Edwin, who was in prison for a year and a half, and very much trying to take care of their own economic interests in the country. And so why do I say that? So Canada has very significant economic interests in Honduras. Canadian mining companies operate several mines in Honduras. The Canadian government, Chrystia Freeland, and the government before the Trudeau government said nothing when Aura Minerals, a Toronto-based mining company, started to dig up a 200-year-old cemetery in western Honduras, taking out bodies after body out of the cemetery, while the people in the communities protested it, saying they didn't want their cemetery to be touched. And there were several people in the communities as a result of protesting that were criminalized, that were accused of all these different crimes like Edwin was, simply because they were defending their cemetery and their community. Canada has significant tourist interests or tourist project interests in the country. There's a Canadian company, and there was actually a one-pager that was given out to everybody when they came in the door. There's a picture on it of a businessman he's actually called the Canadian Porn King. They call him the Porn King. That was Maclean's magazine that called him that. He made millions of dollars selling pornographic videos here in Canada, and he's taken his money that he earned here and went to Honduras and started buying up and buying off government officials, illegally purchasing land on the Caribbean coast of Honduras to build gated communities that are being sold to Canadians here in Canada. And one of the billboards that the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor had taken down in Simcoe County was actually a company that was selling that illegal land to Canadians that wouldn't necessarily know that the land was illegally purchased. Canada also has significant interest in sweatshops, and they have significant interest in the national lottery that actually a Canadian company runs in Honduras. And so, for me and for the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor, though protecting those interests that are very much promoted by the Honduran government was the priority for the Canadian government. They didn't want to criticize a government that was promoting and allowing these friendly business opportunities for Canadian companies and the Canadian government in the country. So they stayed silent when Edwin went to prison. They stayed silent when human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers are killed in Honduras. And they don't speak out about the human rights issue in Honduras. And so I have to close down, but before I end my participation, I wanted to say that I mentioned that Edwin may be sent back to prison, and Honduras is in a really difficult moment right now because the government, the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who illegally ran for a second term in office, committed electoral fraud, and is in power, his brother is being accused of drug trafficking and arms smuggling in New York, in the New York court's Southern District Court. His brother's in jail in New York waiting trial in October. And in that court case, Juan Orlando Hernandez and the former president, Pepe Lobo, who is also on that one page that's shaking, or that's standing next to the Porn King, the Canadian tourist developer. I just lost my train of thought. Oh, they're both mentioned, the former president and the current president are mentioned as co-conspirators in this drug case in this New York court. And so we've been saying for years that Honduras is run by a drug trafficking, corrupt government. And Canada is very much aligned with this government and very much aligned with the corruption and the drug trafficking that the highest levels of the government are involved in. And this isn't something that we're making up. This is something that the New York courts are saying in the documents that are available publicly for people to read. And so that's the type of government that Canada is standing beside. And that's the one that they're staying silent when they commit abuses, like throwing Edwin in jail. And so as the government becomes increasingly scared because of the information coming out of the New York court cases, we are scared that that's going to mean that they're going to crack down even further on protesters and anything that undermines the legitimacy of the government. So Edwin that it's a very difficult time, and we will be looking for your support in the coming weeks in case he is sent back to prison. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it to my mom.
Okay, sorry, I'm kind of quiet, so this is going to be kind of tough for me, but okay, so
Yeah.
I know, I'm going to do my best. Okay, so my name's Yurisa Varela, my family is Honduran. I was born here, so I'm a little more removed from the situation on the ground, but I did money is what's controlling the situation. This is a very manufactured situation that's happening in Honduras. It's not something that is just happening and now it's just a byproduct. This migration is just over time. It has been this priority of putting profit over people, and I think that's important to take note of as well, because this is part of a larger conversation of what's going on in the world, especially with climate change. This is impacting people on the ground, and it's going to continue to get worse and worse. So that's one thing that I did want to highlight. I hope if you have any other questions, feel free to ask. I'm just kind of trying to give a broader kind of perspective. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should add to that. I'm not sure. Yeah, but yes, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Yarissa. I'd like to invite Tyler Shipley to come on up to the table and take a seat. And thank you very much for coming. Wonderful. And I'd like also to welcome Lee Banger. He is a Montreal-based author and political activist, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts about Honduras.
Thanks to everyone for coming out, and thanks to the Honduran, Simcoe County Honduran Endurance Monitor for putting this on and for the very good work that you've been doing the past couple of years. We need a lot more of that work on a lot of different issues. So we are here at Christian Freeland's writing. We have an election coming up. So our foreign minister, who I think maybe we should do as a hypocrisy minister, and that's what I'm going to sort of delve into, is Christian Freeland's hypocrisy on her different foreign policy positions, and how that's overlaid in a whole history of Canadian foreign policy, mythology, double standards, and basically we hear a lot about, from people like Christian Freeland, that Canada's bad, that Canada supports human rights, that Canada is for the rules-based international order, when in fact, if you examine the policy more closely, you find that overwhelmingly what drives Canadian foreign policy are two main things: support for Canadian corporations abroad and support for empire. If you want to try to figure out what's going on in Canadian foreign policy, that's where you need to investigate. Find out what Canadian corporate interests are looking for, and find out what Washington's policy is towards the place.
What way to do it again?
We can go into that later. So in terms of this hypocrisy, there's probably no clearer example, or one of the clearest examples, is of the Lima group that Canada has instigated with Peru. Now there are many members of Latin America that are part of this. A Lima group which is campaigning to oust the Venezuelan government. And our government says over and over again, our Prime Minister himself, Christian Freeland, many, many times, dozens of times even, says that we're basically trying to uphold the Venezuelan Constitution. And that's why Nicolas Maduro's government has to go, and Juan Guaido needs to be the new president, the head of the National Assembly. That's our interpretation of the Venezuelan Constitution. Of course, that's an incorrect interpretation of the Venezuelan Constitution. But one of our allies in this Lima group trying to oust the Venezuelan government is, of course, the government of Honduras, whose constitutional legitimacy is completely, totally illegitimate, right? And under the Constitution, quite clearly, you can't run for a second term. Then, once you get your members of the Supreme Court to allow a second term, then when you're losing the vote, okay, the voting machines go down. When the voting machines come back on, all of a sudden you're in the lead and you win the election. Then there's massive protests, and you kill dozens of people who are protesting your legitimate government. That's one of our allies in the Lima group trying to force our incorrect interpretation of the Venezuelan Constitution on that country. So if you look at Canada's relationship to Honduras, and Tyler will obviously get into a lot more of these details, I just want to run through some of this. Of you have a situation where after Juan Orlando Hernandez wins, Canada immediately follows Washington in endorsing his second term. You have a situation where Canadian officials have repeatedly met Canadian officials in Central America, diplomats, as well as Foreign Minister Christian Freeland, the Prime Minister, met Honduran government officials in recent months. For instance, the Foreign Minister of Honduras came up for a women's foreign minister meeting in Montreal last year. Trudeau was photographed with the Honduran Foreign Minister at the Lima Group meeting in February in Ottawa. You have statements from Canadian officials talking about the bonds of friendship between the Government of Canada and Honduras, referring to the excellent relations that exist between both countries. You have Canada's ambassador retweeting the U.S. Embassy saying, "We congratulate the President Juan Orlando Hernandez for taking the initiative to reaffirm the commitment of his administration to fight against corruption and impunity." You have, from what I can tell, no cutting of aid by Canada to the Honduran government. So you basically have not incredible, but substantive Canadian diplomatic financial support for what is quite clearly a government that does not have the support of the people. Its whole electoral legitimacy is very, very thin. And Juan Orlando Hernandez's political trajectory is the post-coup political trajectory. Right? Is of a coup in 2009 that ousted a mild reformist government, ousted by the military, and you had Canada very much backing that coup. Not, I would say, at a gigantic level, like in 2004 with the elected government of Haiti, but at a very substantive level, a very clear level, where you have a situation where Canadian diplomats, this is at the time of the Harper government, Canadian diplomats justifying the coup when Manuel Zelaya, the elected president, tried to return a week after the coup with a number of Latin American heads of state, and it was 100,000 people, the military killed people trying to repress the protests. The blame, of course, was on the elected president, not our government, but the blame on the elected president, not the military for the violence. And constant sort of statements like that. You had a situation where Canada continued its training program for Honduran military, even though the Honduran military, not a significant program, but a handful of Honduran troops being trained in Canada, even though the Honduran military had just ousted the government. You had Canada not announcing or activating any reduction of its aid. Even the U.S. at one point announced that they would reduce some of the aid. World Bank, others, whether they did or not, that's another question, but at least announced it. The Harper government, nothing. So a continuation of support for this coup government. And then when there were elections 5 or 6 months later, the Canadian government basically endorsed an election that not even the Organization of American States, the OAS, the UN, most of the countries in the hemisphere refused to recognize. Canada immediately recognized, and then went about signing a free trade agreement with the government. That again won very dubious elections. So, in the case of Honduras, I think it's quite clear, in recent years, past decade, it's quite clear that what has driven policy has been Canadian corporate interests. Some of those were already outlined, and Canada's alignment with the U.S. government. Now, we shouldn't be surprised about this. Right? We live in a society where we're told endlessly that Canada is a force for good in the world. It's a total crock. It's just, there's no basis. Any serious investigation finds example after example of Canada aligning with empire, historically British, today American, and aligning with Canadian corporate interests. And just taking a very narrow look at Central America shows you this from a historical standpoint. And it shows you how Canada and Canadian corporations have been part of the process of imperial penetration of Central America. which allows a situation like you have today, people migrating, of incredible amounts of violence, of great inequities within these countries. So Canada has consistently been aligned, if you go back historically, with American power in the region, which has not served Central America very well. Okay, just a few examples. So for instance, when the Americans invaded Panama, killed 4,000 people in 1989, the Brian Mulroney government supported that diplomatically in his rhetoric, supported that at the UN. During the 1980s, during the Central American Wars in the 1980s, while the Honduran military was providing all kinds of support for the American-backed Contras who were waging war against the Sandinistas, the Canadian government continued to support the Honduran military, continued to provide aid in Honduras. But alongside that, consistently held the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which was trying to bring about some modest reforms, reducing inequality, education, literacy programs, health programs, whatnot. Canada blamed the Sandinistas for consistently criticized the Sandinistas for their policies, very much holding the justice-oriented government in Nicaragua to much higher standards than the governments in El Salvador or Honduras at that time. Go back further and you have the coup against Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala, right? An American instigated effort. Well, what was Canada's position? Our great Lester Pearson basically endorsed the coup, refused to talk about how Americans were involved. There was a question about it. Refused to talk about how Americans were involved. Before the coup, Canada helped isolate, refused to begin diplomatic relations with the Guatemalan government. And we have internal documents from Canadian officials on the ground consistently demonizing Arbenz government, saying it's communistic, it's giving labor too many rights, etc. In 1932, Canadian warships received a cable. London informed Ottawa that there was a quote communist uprising underway in El Salvador and a possibility of danger to British banks, railways, and other British lives and property. 2 Canadian naval vessels were dispatched to the coast, and they would provide important support to the military as they would go about killing thousands, tens of thousands in a peasant indigenous uprising. In the book Northern Shadows, a very good book about Canada's role in Central America, published in the end of the 1980s, said, quote, two-ship convoy would stand by and observe one of the worst massacres of civilians in the history of the Americas. Canadian troops actually docked, and a Canadian company provided pay to the Honduran or to the El Salvador military, who were to a certain extent staying in their barracks, to get them out and to do the repression that was needed. A decade before that, in Costa Rica, in 1917, the Royal Bank loaned a unpopular Costa Rican leader $200,000, and now multiple millions of dollars, to Federico Tinoco, just as he was about to flee from popular uprising. And the new government said, this is odious. He stole the money, he took it, we knew he was unpopular, we're not paying this money back. And what was Ottawa's response? To send 3 naval vessels to the coast of Costa Rica to say, hey, you've got to negotiate with the Royal Bank of Canada. In the book, Canadian Gunboat Diplomacy notes, quote, in 1921 in Costa Rica, Canadian vessels Aurora, Patriot, and Nutrition helped the Royal Bank of Canada satisfactorily settle an outstanding claim with the government of that country. Right? That's an example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy historically. So there's a whole history of Canadian, and I'm not going to get into it, I go into some of this in my Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, whole history of Canadian capital, Canadian corporations, going back more than a century, having major economic interests and aligning with the most reactionary forces within Central America. The hypocrisy of Chrystia Freeland is kind of endless. We could have a whole, certainly have a whole talk about it. I plan to write a book about it if they win this next election. But just a couple other examples in the hemisphere that I think are worth mentioning. Okay, so in Brazil, right, what's Canada's position been on the fact that the Workers' Party has had this constitutional coup that ousted Dilma Rousseff? Then they imprisoned the most popular politician who probably would have, almost certainly would have won the election, Lula, and then you get this, far-right, Trump-like figure, Bolsonaro. Has Canada been critical of this? Of course not. Continue on with its policies. Billions and billions of dollars of Canadian investments in Brazil. And as the CDC pointed out, after Bolsonaro's election, there is a lot to be liked for some of the Canadian mining sector with a Bolsonaro government. A more clear example and more substantive example of hypocrisy and Canada on one hand saying we're about human rights, we're about rule-based order, we need to bring democracy to Venezuela. Take the example of Haiti. It gets almost no attention. Just in the last couple of days, another whole upsurge of protest. Here you have a government of Jovenel Moïse, president, who almost no electoral legitimacy. Very few people vote. They only held the elections, his predecessor from the same party, only held the elections because of massive protest, and is found to have pilfered $2 billion from the Petrocaribe, the subsidized oil program that Venezuela initiated. And since at least the start of this year, but going back even a few months, since February, there's a massive general strike in Haiti. The only reason Jovenel Moïse's government, presidency, it isn't the government at this point, but the only reason Moïse hasn't been forced from office, a week-long general strike that shut down most of the country. The only reason it hasn't been forced from office is because it continues to have the support of two embassies, Washington and Ottawa. So even though there's huge amounts of repression, even important sectors of the traditional regressive Haitian elite have turned against the president, we have a government that stays because Canada and the U.S. support that government. And we provide the financial, the training for the Haitian police as they repress demonstrations and they kill dozens of people in recent months. So you can look at lots of parts of the world. It's kind of an endless stream of examples of not coming close to standing up for this rules-based order, for standing up for human rights that we hear a lot of rhetoric about. You go from Palestine to nuclear arms, nuclear disarmament questions where Canada refuses to engage in conferences that most of the world are supporting, to the Saudi arms deal, the weaponry to Saudi Arabia, to refusal to restart diplomatic relations with Iran. And there's a consistent pattern of the Trudeau government and Chrystia Freeland not standing up for human rights or democracy, but telling us consistently that they are. And I would just say that to conclude, I think that unfortunately there is no electoral solution to our problem in the sense that this is a much deeper and more fundamental problem in Canadian foreign policy. Even if you got an NDP government or a Green government for that matter, you would only slightly lessen the bad of Canadian foreign policy. This is a long-standing, historic, structural issue that necessitates much more transformation than just a new government. So there is no electoral solution in the short term, but there are, I think, electoral ways to engage electoral. There is a campaign in this riding to fire Freeland, right? Ouster for her role in Venezuela particularly, but in a number of other foreign policy issues. There is the Voice of Women has a picket in front of her office, I believe it's monthly. So there are ways for people to engage in expressing opposition to these policies. And we'll obviously hear the group organizing this tonight has done some of that work in terms of doing what they can to free a political prisoner and to draw attention to Canada's role in unjust, in supporting unjust imprisonment. But these are much more fundamental questions. So these are bigger picture, longer term questions of how do we build a counterforce to a Canadian foreign policy that's oriented around corporate interests and empire. How do we build a Canadian foreign policy that's really about advancing what I think everyone in this room wants to advance, not just rhetorically, but human rights, internationalism, international solidarity. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. May I introduce Tyler Shipley? Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Sorry for coming late. I was coming straight from teaching, so I raced over here. I apologize for walking in the middle of Karen's talk. It's so nice to see Karen. It's been a while. I've known Karen for a long time, going back to many years. Louder? Yeah. Going back many years in Honduras, trips that I took down there, research trips, activist solidarity trips, in which I got to know the situation in Honduras, certainly not as well as Karen, but well enough to write and speak about it here, and to talk about Canada's role specifically. What I'm going to do today, I think, is a little different. Karen's spoken already about Honduras. Teresa has given us sort of the context around the migrant crisis. Eve has said much of what I might have said on a different day, covering so much of the historical scope of what Canada's done. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to take some of what Eve has already talked about and frame it, and maybe try to hang it on a sort of a theoretical understanding of what Canada is. This is a big problem. We want to believe, I always have believed, that Canada was, a state in which we could, if we worked hard, push it in certain directions, make it better, make it good. That there were traditions in Canada, the peacekeeping tradition, for instance, that was something we could build on, something positive, something solid. Some of that is true. But I think following on one of the last things that you've said, I would put to you that Canada is founded on two principles. And they are settler capitalism on the one hand, and the colonial imagination on the other. Canada was founded on these two principles. Canada's first foreign policy was with the Indigenous nations here. And it may seem like an odd thing to do to suggest that we can understand Canada's relationship to Honduras through an understanding of Canada's colonial roots. But that's precisely what I think we need to do, is to understand what was Canada about in its foundation. What were the principles upon which Canada was built, and how do those continue to exist in Canada's other engagements in the world in 150 years from now? So Canada is founded then on, I hope we will all agree to call it genocide. It was part of the genocide that afflicted this part of the world. Teresa, in her comments, sort of said, this all goes back to 1492, and it does. I agree with that. It does go back to Columbus. It does go back to the colonization of this land. And in terms of Canada specifically, the early British settlement, which becomes Canada, was about two things. It was on the one hand about creating a capitalist state. I mean, it really explicitly was about getting the land. And I want to focus on that piece, the land, because so much of what is happening right now in Honduras is struggles over land. Right? It's indigenous people, or at least Honduran peasants, organizing to protect their access to land. Land on which they could live, land on which they could farm, land on which they could raise their communities. And of course, it is capital trying to encroach on that land. Right? It's the African palm plantations. It's Randy Jorgensen's tourist resort hotels, cruise ports. It's the mining companies literally building mines on the land. This is settler capitalism. And it's what Canada is founded upon. The idea that this land was to be taken and converted from what it was, which was land that was shared by everyone, land that was used by the communities, for the communities, and converted into private property for profit. Land that would be used to extract profit for the owners of that land. I know this sounds very academic, I know it sounds very theoretical, abstract, but I actually think that it's really important to understand that that was one of the main reasons Canada was built. I mean, this is explicit in the founders. This is explicit in what the fathers of Confederation wanted to do. They specifically wanted to get the West. They had already taken over much of the East, but Confederation was about making a plan, building a new plan to take the rest of Canada from Indigenous people for their own use. That is settler capitalism. That, to me, is the material goal at the heart of what Canada is. And so when Eve was talking about all of these different cases where Canada goes out and supports capital, in the El Salvador example, I had it in my notes, I was going to talk about El Salvador as well. Anyway, it's Canada making sure that El Salvador is a place where capital can go and capital can extract profit. How dare these indigenous people in the 1930s in El Salvador think that they could take back the land for their own use? Canada would not abide that. Not in Canada and not in El Salvador. How dare Chileans in the 1970s believe that they could take Chilean industries and nationalize them and make them their own? Make the earth and the minerals inside of it Chilean property. How dare they take that away from private capital? That's why Canada participates in the project to overthrow Salvador Allende's socialist government in Chile in the 1970s. Specifically, Canada had funded his opposition. When Allende won free, fair elections in 1970, Canada cut off all ties, refused to meet with him, refused to have diplomatic relations, made no economic donations, cut off all aid, and then the minute that Allende was murdered, amongst thousands of others in Chile, by a military overthrow of that government, the one that led to the rise of Augusto Pinochet, one of the most notorious dictators in Latin American history, Canada immediately started up foreign aid once again, made massive donations, lobbied the IMF to make donations to restart aid to the Pinochet government. The ambassador in Canada cabled back to Ottawa and said, "We see no reason to unduly withhold recognition of the new government." Why? Because it was a government that would support capital. Most of the cases that Eve presented fit that pattern. And they do today, too. They do in Haiti, they do in Honduras, they do in Canada's support for Colombia, but not Canada's support for Venezuela. So this is separate capitalism, and this is one piece of the story. The other piece that I want to add is the colonial imagination. The idea inherent in the construction of Canada that white people were better. I'm sorry to say it in such a blunt way, but that's fundamentally what it was. You read what Canadians said when they created Canada, when they wrote the Indian Act in 1876, when they built the residential schools, to kill the Indian in the child. That's a direct quote. I'm sure many of you know it. Other direct quotes included, "We need to find a final solution of the Indian problem." Yeah, this is a quote that was taken up by someone else, as I'm sure you know. These are the ways that Canadians spoke about Indigenous people. That they were savage, that they were barbaric, that they were backwards, that Canada represented the advance of civilization, that Canada was doing Indigenous people a favor by breaking them from their traditions, by breaking them from their ways of life, their modes of living, their economic, political, and social traditions, that these were backwards, that these needed to be fixed, that they needed to be fixed, they needed to be made more white, made more European, made more Canadian. And this was the logic that Canada maintained throughout the residential school experience, throughout the 60s school. right? The grabbing of children, indigenous children, and taking them into white foster homes. The Millennium School. It's still happening. Still happening today that indigenous children are being taken and put in white families because they are told, because we are told, that their own families couldn't do it, couldn't manage to parent them properly, which of course means couldn't parent them in ways that were acceptable to white Canada, to settler Canada. Again, I know this all sounds a little much, but it is the logic that ran through Canada's colonial project. And I would argue that that same logic, that colonial imagination, has animated Canada's relations around the world since then. When Canada sent gunships to El Salvador, I can't remember if this was in your quotes or not, the Prime Minister Bennett, specifically said, we need to stop this uprising of communist Indians. He was explicit about the fact that it was indigenous people rising up in El Salvador. Canada knew that. Canada was specifically opposed to that. How dare they? In all of Canada's relations with other countries, particularly non-European countries, there has been an air of white supremacy, an air of certainty that Canada knew best. When India demanded independence from Britain, a Canadian magazine said, India is not a nation and will never be. When India, Pakistan, and other countries in South Asia did in fact get their independence, a Canadian newspaper portrayed the leaders of those countries in diapers, with soothers, because they were children. Because how could they possibly run their own country? This was the claim. When the Congo demanded its independence in the 1960s, Canada said they're not ready. They can't. They need a period of tutelage. What they need, Canada said, was a political quarantine until they were ready, until they would understand how to run a modern state. These aren't isolated cases. This is the norm. This is how Canada has always responded when people around the world have demanded their independence and demanded a course that was different from what Canada wanted. That they were backwards, that they were savage, that they were barbaric, that they couldn't possibly run their own state. Listen to what Canadian soldiers said when they were in Afghanistan about Afghans. It's a terrible, terrible book by Christy Blatchford. Just an awful, awful book. But most of it is quotes from Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan, so you get a real window into how Canadians saw themselves in Afghanistan. They called it Indian country. That's what Canadian soldiers called Afghanistan. That wasn't unique. Canadian soldiers have called Somalia Indian country when they went as peacekeepers to Somalia and left in shame after they murdered Somali children, tortured a Somali teenager, because they believed that they were better. They believed that these Somalis were ungrateful, that Canada was there to help them, and they weren't thanking Canada enough. They were stealing from the Canadian camp. Canadian soldiers were filled with this white supremacist attitude and took it out on the bodies of Somalis. As I say, left in shame when this was found out. In Afghanistan, Canadian soldiers said, we're walking with people who are 2,000 years behind. It's like with people who are from National Geographic. This is the 2000s. This is supposed to be modern Canada. We're supposed to be past all of that colonial baggage, and yet there it was in the way Canada spoke about Afghanistan. To bring this all together, I want to come back to Honduras. This is how Canadians have treated Honduras and Hondurans. How dare Hondurans claim that they know how to run a democratic state, that they know how to run elections, that they can run free and fair elections and choose their own leaders? Canada knows best. Canada looked at the situation, saw the military overthrow a democratic government, attack people in the streets for protesting against that, and Canada said, I don't think you people know what you're doing. You know, you should really just trust us. We'll help you sort this out. We're going to get someone in there that can make Honduras work. And of course, what they meant is a Honduras that would work for the Canadian capital, a Honduras that would work for the mining companies, for the sweatshops, for the tourist industry. But the way they framed it was always that Canada knew best. When Michael Curtin sat on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Honduras about the Honduran coup, yes, a Canadian who had been a lawyer in the mining industry, he sat on this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He wrote a report afterwards, and he said, I don't know, people just in Honduras, they just like the system as it is. They like the status quo. They don't, they didn't want it. They didn't want change. Zelaya wanted to change things, but Hondurans didn't want change. I'm sorry to say, in this place, that's bullshit. That is bullshit. Hondurans had demanded change. They had elected change. They had protested for change. They were putting their lives on the line for change. Fundamentally, the very idea that Canada should tell Hondurans what they want is colonialism. It is the colonial imagination. It is the same logic that led Canada to tell Indigenous people what they wanted and how they should live when Canada was formed. So that's what I wanted to offer today. It's a kind of a historical tying together of all of this. I hope this has been useful. I don't know if it was.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'd like to open the floor up for questions of our panel.
Who were the MPs that were supporting? Or were there any?
Did you repeat?
Karen, you mentioned you were in Ottawa a fair bit. Who were the MPs that were supporting you, if any? I know who didn't support you. Yeah.
I'm going to pass that to my mom because they went, the Simcoe County Honduras Rights Monitor, Christine Nugent, and my mom went several times to Ottawa, and so because I couldn't leave the country for a long time, and I couldn't leave Honduras, so I'm going to pass that to my mom to answer.
Doug, that's a very good question. I think as far as getting a lot of lip service, we got quite a bit of that from the Liberal government, so that was something that did not happen. We got an amazing support from Elizabeth May, who not only offered support and she actually asked what she could do. She offered to sponsor a petition, which I have with me tonight, a paper petition, and she would bring it up in the House. So the Green Party of Canada was very supportive. They met with us every time that we went to Ottawa, which I think was about 8 times. The Conservatives were not supportive, except similar lip service, except for our local MP, who is Conservative, and he was and still is very supportive. He's a traditional MP who speaks to his constituents' requests, and who is very supportive of his area, of his community. And so we got the most support from him. Is he able to do very much? Well, he met with us and offered his office to Minister Freeland's aides, Trevor Harrison. He set us up to go to Global Affairs Canada and meet with some people from Global Affairs, all Liberal. Yet he wasn't able to do much. So I would say the most support came from the Conservatives, except it was from our own local MP, and yet he wasn't able to do much. We did get some support from the NDP as well, too, but they were unable to, again, do much.
There's actually a lot of people in this room that spoke with their MPs directly, like my Aunt Mary, who's sitting there next to you. Cara Lee from BC, she also pushed her MP as well, but nothing. Yep. Yes.
Okay, I have a couple linked questions. First 2 questions are to the panel at large. Basically, the issue is, what specifically, you may have touched on this, what specifically could Canada do if we had an NDP government tomorrow, or if we had, if we had a government that could be made to take this seriously in Canada, which is already a big leap of the imagination. What kind of leverage would a Canadian government have with Honduras? What specifically could it do, and what should we be demanding the Canadian government to do? I mean, we said there's some foreign aid. Should that be cut off? I mean, is it humanitarian aid, or is it the type of aid that would really actually hurt the Honduran government if we cut it off? Breaking diplomatic relations, like even as activists, if we're going and demonstrating, we want to have 1, 2, 3. Otherwise, they'll just say, "Oh, we understand. We're worried about it too. Trust us. Leave it to us." We need to have something where we can say and then come back in a month have you done this or not? So what type of steps should we be demanding the Canadian government to do? Sort of second part of that question is, it's just one example, would it be relatively easy for Canada to control or what Canadian companies do in Honduras? Could we pretty much punish them if they, if we wanted to? And should we do that? And then the third question I'm going to ask specifically to Karen, because I think you really know what's going on the ground, being there, is if Canada decided to, I was going to say use the big stick, and that's a horrible, horrible connotation, so a horrible history of that expression, so I'll change it. But if Canada really decided to stand up for human rights in Honduras, basically, cut off the Honduran government, punish them as much as we can with, just in terms of cutting off what we do already, would that, how fragile is the Honduran government? Would that affect a big change on the ground in the way Honduras deals with demonstrations? I'm saying that because I was a reporter in Haiti about 10 years ago, and I got the impression, I asked some Haitians, I said, well, if there wasn't a UN peacekeeping force in Haiti, like what would happen? Would the popular side be strong enough to win? And there was sort of a discussion about that, even the Haitians didn't really know the answer. But I'm asking the same question about Honduras. Would the Honduran repressive apparatus be strong enough to stay in power without the support of countries like Canada? Can we pull the plug and make them fail? Or not?
Yeah, so Hondurans actually, various Honduran organizations, indigenous organizations, women's organizations, peasants, or like small farmers organizations, are actually calling on the U.S. government to suspend aid to the Honduran government.
Okay.
They say the money's not getting to us, it doesn't help us, it stays in the pockets of the rich and the corrupt government, or it gets stolen by the government or government officials. We want that aid suspended. And so I would say suspend all aid to Canadian aid to Honduras, because it's not doing what Christian Freeland and the Canadian government are saying that it's doing. And so that's not from me, that's actually from Honduran organizations that have gotten behind a law that was presented to the U.S. Congress called the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Act, named after the environmentalist that was murdered in 2016. She wasn't just an environmentalist, she was an indigenous activist, very, very well known all around the country and the world. So suspending aid would not hurt the situation, and actually that's something that the Canadian government and Christian Freeland's office have consistently told us they can't do because it would hurt the majority of Hondurans, the people that need it the most. And that's the consistent response that we've gotten from Freeland's office and before the Trudeau government, because I asked the Canadian government to not sign a free trade agreement with Honduras in 2013 when the Conservatives were in power too, because the human rights situation was so bad. And they said, no, we need to engage because our engagement can make things better. And now Honduras is in a worse state. Now they're open firing on protesters. Now these caravans of thousands of people are fleeing in large numbers because of how bad it's gotten. And so they've consistently said, no, we need to engage because we have health programs, we're giving money to this anti-corruption body that's exposing corruption. And I would say that they need to suspend all of that aid. And it's really not doing what they're saying it's doing. For example, during the electoral crisis, actually earlier, a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, and for 3 months ago, there was a picture that circulated on social media. And it was a truck that had a Canadian flag on it that said Chagas disease only. It was owned by the Honduran Ministry of Health. And it was used to so-called combat Chagas disease, which is a parasitic disease that's quite common in Honduras. And there was a Canadian flag next to the Honduran government flag. And it was that truck was purchased under this program that Canada had been financing to eliminate Chagas disease. It sounds good. But who is in that truck? There was military soldiers that were in the back of the pickup truck. And that picture was snapped close to a protest where those same military forces were open firing on protesters.
On their own people.
On their own people. But mean, the truck was purchased by the Canadian government for this alleged support that they're giving to help the majority of the poor in Honduras. And so Hondurans have consistently said that while you're giving aid to a government that's either stealing it, that's stealing the money, you're basically subsidizing corruption as well. You're basically giving money to state institutions, saying that you're carrying out all these programs, while there's widespread evidence that shows that a lot of this money is being stolen from the Ministry of Education, from the Ministry of Health. So Canada's aid is actually subsidizing corruption. And so Honduran organizations have consistently said, suspend the aid for human rights reasons, the fact that it's not going to where they say it's going, and because it's actually making the situation worse. So we say, along with Honduran organizations, to suspend aid to Honduras, period.
You had another question, and then just a quick answer, perhaps, in regard to the situation of the mining. Did you mention the corporations?
Yeah.
Could you speak?
Corporate responsibility.
Or how easy would it be for Canada to basically control the activities of Canadian mining companies?
I can give you a short, sort of a quick hint on that, which would just be to say that in terms of what could happen, if we somehow immediately got a Canadian government that was good, it's hard to conceive of how this would happen in the current moment. And for Canada to make a difference, a positive difference, to do something like suspend all aid, would play a role, but it would actually have to be effective, I think, to really have an effect on the Honduran dictatorship would have to also include the United States, like Karen said, and other governments that sort of participate in these things together. So Canada's role would have to be, yes, suspend aid, isolate rogue states like this, as Canada briefly did during South African apartheid. Right? I mean, there is precedent for this, and that came out of community mobilizations like this that forced the Canadian state eventually to oppose South African apartheid. And once that was undertaken with other governments, it did have an effect. Apartheid was ended. So, I mean, I would say that, yes, there are ways of conceiving of how these things could be changed, but they would also have to be about coalition building. Canada, at this point, leans, right? It's part of the kind of lean that allows the Honduran government to stay in power alongside the United States and other allies. It would have to lean the other way and pull some of those other states the other way, too. That would be my sort of quick reply.
And just to kind of pick up on that, concretely, so a week after the coup against Zelaya, there's massive protests. There's a number of heads of state, Latin American heads of state, that are with him trying to get back in the country. If Washington and Ottawa weren't both somewhat openly and substantially quietly providing that support, the coup's probably reversed. You never know for sure, but the coup's probably reversed, and the whole history is different right to this day, right? And then right back to even longer imperial history that So you're never going to know. I mean, I think Chris, knowing you and comparing it to the Haiti situation, Honduras is not a country that's as imperially penetrated as Haiti is, and in that sense that
investigate what was like human rights abuses that are committed in countries like Honduras by Canadian companies. And Christian Freeland's office totally gutted it, and I don't think it's not moving forward. And so any sort of efforts that there have been to actually hold any Canadian companies responsible for what they do in countries like Honduras have been totally squashed. But that's something that we need to do up here. Like, we need to change Canadian public policy so that Canadian companies that are based in Canada aren't going to countries like Honduras where the government's shooting at protesters and throwing people that are trying to change their reality, like as political prisoners. They need to be held accountable here, the companies that are doing that there, and that are basically jumping alongside the Honduran government that is actually committing these abuses.
And also, first of all, thank you, Karen, for all the work you've done and everybody that has supported, that has been, working this hard. As a part of the Honduran diaspora, many of us are here. I just want to let you guys know that we also have been working really hard, not in the way of directly following the Canadian path. We have sent 1,000 postcards to Freeland, demanding the freedom of Edwin Espina, along with the justice for Berta. We have heard zero response. We've held protests. We've held vigils. We've done a lot of grassroots within our limited time, because most of not only the Honduran, but along with the solidarity with the Latin diaspora, we have as well created petitions about the refugee crisis, build coalitions to try to do all this, to raise all about that and make the connections. So I think it's important to understand that it's a very difficult fight here, as well obviously in Honduras as well. But whatever we can, whatever we have done, we've done it to raise awareness along the lines of whatever is happening back in Honduras. But also our communities are struggling trying to build this up, to kind of raise the voice, and it hasn't been easy for us either. And we tried to do whatever way, the Canadian way, writing letters, petitions, emails. I even myself, I wrote 120 emails to Freeland, zero response. For every day that there was a killing, a protest, I would just send her a link and say, hello, this is what happened, zero response. So even personally. So. But just keep in mind that every support is so important. And if you have chance to do something on your own, like write, like no stop, and maybe the more we do, the more we can get a response.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much to our panel. We appreciate your wisdom and your knowledge, and for sharing that with us. I'd like everyone to help themselves to coffee and tea and some baked goods, and I appreciate you all coming, so enjoy.
Thank you.